Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'll give you 10 seconds to grab a seat if you haven't yet had time to do so. It's a pleasure to welcome you to day 2 of our Humanitarian Forum, and particularly to this session where we're going to be looking at human mobility and forced displacement in Latin America and the Caribbean. We will be talking about why people are fleeing for survival, and hopefully we will also be discussing some possible solutions. We will hear testimonies from various sides, and both in the room and online, so good morning to those of you who are following us online, you will have the opportunity to ask questions. Now, if you're in the room, you only have to raise your hand, so that's easy enough. If you are following us online, you should go to Slido, hashtag EHF2023, and then you choose the room. We are in the Aquarium room. Doesn't look like an aquarium, there's no window, but it doesn't matter. So Aquarium, and choose the date. Today's the 21st. And then you'll land on the right session. You also have, if you want to make it simpler, a QR code on your screen which you can scan. And that will allow you to send us your questions. We will be enjoying graphic recording throughout the session. So on a couple of occasions during the sessions, I'll be referring to our graphic artist, and we'll see where he stands with his interpretation of our debates. We have interpretation available in French, English, and Spanish. So you have headphones, and I think the channels, yes, the channels are coming up on the screens, so you know which one to turn to if you require interpretation. Now, besides the housekeeping points which we need to set, it's also important to set the scene of the discussion we're going to have. The situation in the Latin American and Caribbean region is extremely complex. The internal and international displacement of huge parts of the populations has generated dire humanitarian consequences. The UNHCR estimates that in the area, 19.9 million people have been forcibly displaced. That is 20% of the global figure. So it's a huge number. And since the beginning of this year, the situation has even worsened in some areas. These people are trying to reach the USA, Canada, or in South America, they're aiming for Chile, Colombia, or Costa Rica. And they go through irregular passages and generally in dramatic situations in order to escape armed conflict, persecution, trafficking, organized crime, you name it. The aim of our panel this morning, and that's why I'm also very happy to welcome the extremely competent speakers that we have, the aim of our discussion is really to take stock, assess the challenges which are generated by this situation, and as I said, to try and provide some recommendations in order to find the appropriate humanitarian answer to that crisis, which is still broadly underestimated at global level. To help us understand these challenges, it's a great pleasure to welcome our speakers, and I have right next to me Yavel Mireia Francis, who's ambassador for the mission of Panama to the EU. We have next to her Carlos Torrinho, member of the European Parliament. We have Julieta Valls-Noyes, who's Assistant Secretary of State for the Population, Refugees and Migration in the US. Ugochi Daniels, who's Deputy Director General for Operations at the IOM, the International Organization for Migration, and Sabrina Lustgarten, who's the Executive Vice President of HIAS. Good morning to you all. Before I give you the floor and ask you my first question, I did say we would hear testimonies. We have a short video to present some testimonies of the people we will be talking about. So let's watch the video.
como persona, primero, corres un riesgo muy grande porque tú quieres llegar a tu destino, en mi caso Chile, pero en el camino puedes perder la vida. O sea, hay otras personas que se dedican a hacer las cosas mal, te roban, te puñalean, te violan, te maltratan. Los refugios son una opción, pero al fin y al cabo entonces terminan no siéndolo muchas veces. Incluso te tienes que quedar metido dentro del monte para que el que va pasando no te vea. Entonces también corres el riesgo de que un animal, una culebra, cualquier cosa, dependiendo en qué selva estés, te pique o te haga algo. Y estás en un sitio que está desolado, no puedes. Tienes que subir en mula sin que el chofer se dé cuenta, tienes que pedir la cola, te denigran como mujer. En el caso mío, por lo menos si le pides una cola a alguien, te dice sí, te doy la cola, pero si me das sexo. O sí, te doy o sí, te doy este dinero, pero si te vas media hora conmigo. Entonces, wow, el hecho de estar en la calle, de que otro ser humano te coaccione de esa manera, o te degrade de esa manera, o te humille de esa manera, es bastante fuerte. El riesgo también es tu condición anímica, tus ánimos. Los ánimos se ponen por el piso. Ya uno como ser humano caminando siente que no vale nada. Te tienes que despojar de tus cosas valiosas, fotografía, porque el peso no te deja caminar, tu ropa, terminar queriendo conseguir un río para poder tomar agua, bañarte. Oye, si me pongo a decirte, son infinitas las cosas que uno de verdad vive caminando. Porque incluso nada más el camino no es nada más la prueba. También cuando llegas, enfrentarte al que es dueño de su casa, que no te quiere allí, al que no te quiere porque le va a quitar el empleo, al que no te quiere porque eres un estorbo, porque tienes tu país, porque tienes tu casa, a la falta de humanidad de las otras personas. Entonces, si me preguntas, es una constante lucha para todo, mental, física, en todo sentido.
Very moving testimony, but also how true and reflecting the situation of thousands, tens of thousands of people. My first question will be for you, Ms. Francis. Panama is a transit country for thousands of migrants and refugees, and they come from many nationalities, many continents even. And they cross from the south to North America, generally through what is probably the most dangerous pass on their way, the infamous Darien Gap between Colombia and Panama. What could you share with us maybe about this situation from your end, and what would be your recommendation to the different stakeholders and the different countries in the region to help alleviate that situation?
Yes. Bueno, en primer lugar, buenos días. Agradezco muchísimo la oportunidad de poder compartir con este distinguido panel esta situación que vívidamente de un testimonio ha condensado la gran complejidad de lo que esto implica. Lo primero que quiero reiterar, como bien ha dicho el testimonio, es que Darién, que es la experiencia más vívida en Panamá, no es una ruta migratoria. Darién es una jungla. Y por tanto, la experiencia y las consecuencias de utilizar Darién como un paso de migración irregular es una constante lucha por la vida, no solamente por la parte física y de las inclemencias de una jungla, sino por lo bien expuesto igualmente de los riesgos que personas sin ningún escrúpulo imponen sobre los transeúntes o las personas que, forzadas a migrar por situaciones críticas en sus países, optan por caminar entre 7 y 10 días por una jungla terrífica para lograr algún futuro para ellos, para sus mujeres embarazadas o para sus niños. 20% de las últimas migraciones contadas en Panamá son menores de edad. Entonces, el problema es crítico, es multidimensional y tenemos que detenerlo. Cuando se pregunta qué es lo que pudiéramos recomendar o pudiéramos conversar con respecto a este tema, Panamá habla mucho del concepto de responsabilidad compartida. No creo que hay un solo país, sea de origen, de tránsito o de destino, ni una sola organización, ni un solo donante, que solos o en forma aislada podamos resolver este problema. Porque, como hemos escuchado, las dimensiones son tan específicas, pero tan profundas en tantas dimensiones, que se requiere un esfuerzo plurimundial. Como bien mencionabas, Florence, a Panamá le ha tocado vivir el tránsito de más de 40 nacionalidades en un año por la ruta del Darién. Entonces, no estamos hablando solamente de un tema de América Latina, estamos hablando de una crisis mundial que a nosotros vemos de cerca y, por tanto, es muy íntimo para los programas de políticas públicas en Panamá y que en ayuda de los organismos internacionales y los donantes estamos haciendo el mejor esfuerzo para recibir esos migrantes que pasan por nuestro país, donde hemos escuchado, Gachi, que bien has mencionado, es el primer lugar donde se sienten seguros luego de una pesadilla. Tenemos que detenerlo. Y la forma de detenerlo es involucrando un concepto mucho más profundo. Hay cooperación importante, pero no es suficiente. Necesitamos funding para la inmediatez, que es mantener la vida y la seguridad de estos migrantes. Pero en segundo lugar, necesitamos una fuerza mucho más profunda, un verdadero compromiso de todos los países, de todos los involucrados, de todos los organismos, de los ciudadanos, para incluso reconocer temas como se han mencionado, de que estas personas no migran por voluntad. Lo que toma a un migrante hacer esa travesía es porque la situación que tienen en sus países es terrible. Y eso hay una consideración humana que también tenemos que trabajar en los países de tránsito y los países de destino para poder entender la dimensión y hacia dónde se enfrentan estas personas. Finalmente, para el caso de Panamá, y un componente que se ha desarrollado como un efecto colateral muy negativo, como mencioné, Darién es una jungla y es un parque nacional protegido por UNESCO por su biodiversidad. Este impacto de las migraciones masivas, que en el año 2022 llegó a ser más de 200.000 personas, implica también un daño al ambiente severo, a uno de los principales pulmones de la región y uno de los parques protegidos más grandes de la subregión centroamericana. El problema es serio, el problema es grave, hay muchas acciones, pero tenemos que reforzarlas y en particular tener acciones concretas, medibles y un profundo compromiso de todos los involucrados para poder llegar a disolver este flagelo que es realmente la peor crisis humanitaria que estamos enfrentando.
Thank you very much. Ms. Daniels, the IOM that you represent here today is co-leader in the coordination of the response to what really is one of the largest migration crises definitely in the region, and unfortunately not the only one. But how can the IOM ensure that there is a joint analysis and a regional coordination to that response, and particularly if we consider the multiplicity and the complexity of all of the coordination for all the platforms of the region? I mean, there's many organizations involved, and so what role should each of the actors involved play? How is coordination? We've just heard from Ambassador Francis the need for coordination. So how can that take place?
Thank you very much, Florence, and good morning to everyone, as well as everyone who's online. I think I first of all want to start off with the testimony that we heard and really highlight that this is a testimony that I've heard many times, not just when I was in the Darien Gap. I've heard it from those that I've spoken to in Niger, having been rescued from the desert. We see it with flows in the Horn of Africa, that the perils that migrants, refugees go through on such journeys. And so the response I'm going to give to your question, or set of questions, though specific in the context now of what's happening in the Americas, it's relevant for the whole world, because that's what we see. Flows are mixed flows of migrants, of refugees, and how we as a global community manage that has global application. So starting first and foremost with the need for stronger alignment between both compacts, the Global Compact on Migration and the Global Compact for refugees. We see that this is a key milestone for a comprehensive approach for addressing human mobility. And there's no greater example of that than the Los Angeles Declaration, which is based on which draws from both of the compacts. And what we have seen through the declaration is unprecedented support from member states with a hemispheric approach of 21 governments. So this is really the political chapeau and commitment that is needed to address the flows which impact the whole hemisphere. I've already mentioned that it's built on the both of the compacts. It's anchored in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And this really marks a turning point for regional cooperation. Increasing the coordination and cooperation between the governments in the Americas is crucial. And we know that migration has many important and positive benefits and is inevitable and is needed, but also it will be a challenge for those who have to experience, as we saw in the testimony, the very perilous journey. So from the perspective of IOM, the declaration is a positive step in that direction of regional cooperation in establishing a forum for discussing migration issues and indicating that governments in the region, as we've heard from Her Excellency from Panama, are taking migration seriously. But we need now to support its full implementation and developing mechanisms for continued collaboration and action plans for following up on the political commitment. So this is where the multilateral system comes in. And within the UN, we have the regional UN network on migration. We have issue-based coalitions on human mobility. And these are mechanisms that bring together the UN system for effective coordination, and again, in responding to the political commitment represented through the Los Angeles Declaration. But then there's also the Interagency Coordination Platform for Refugees and Migrants, commonly known as the R4V platform, which not just brings together the 17 countries co-led by IOM and UNHCR, but also 200 partners from civil society, as well as faith-based organizations and NGOs in Latin America and the Caribbean. So this is a really good example of how partners can work jointly through a coordinated approach while allowing for a flexible response to the regional context. I would also like to highlight the importance of the Secretary General's action agenda on internal displacement, because there's not been enough focus, or let me rewind, let me say this more positively, because we recognize the need to focus on investing in long-term solutions. And this is really a call for a paradigm shift from a humanitarian response to a solutions-oriented one, through stronger engagement of development, peace and security actors with government leadership. My final point relates to data and the importance of internal displacement data and analysis that needs to go beyond counting numbers of people who are displaced, but also defining how many of them manage to come out of situations of displacement and what those solutions were. So from IOM, we counted at least 33 million post-displacement returnees in 2021. And in the first 6 months of last year alone, this number has already passed 40 million, including 33 million internal returnees. So as IOM, we can't yet claim coverage of the full hemisphere, but our data is nationally representative and provides insights on what's happening in the hemisphere. So seeking solutions is not just about those who are on the move, it's also supporting those who want to stay. And what does it take to stay? And when we get into discussions of climate change, it also looks at adaptation and livelihoods that are resilient to climate change. But for those who want to return, how can we support them to ensure returns are successful and sustainable? So investing in IDP data for solutions can result in outcomes. So while we know that the future is unpredictable, but we can, as a collective, with all the capacities that we have, ensure that right from the beginning, we are always working towards a dignified, sustainable outcome for all that works for host countries, receiving countries, countries of transit, migrants, refugees, host communities, and so that the next time we gather, we're listening to testimonies of how people had the capacity and skills to be able to stay, or if they moved regularly, they moved with dignity, and they moved safely. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Valls-Neuss, the US administration supports ambitious initiatives to tackle the root causes of migration in the region, and in the meantime, there are still a lot of people on the move who are exposed to risks, and these risks continue to increase. What's your organization's strategy, short and midterm, to provide assistance to those who are fleeing and to promote protection, really, for them? And I'm talking short to midterm. We've heard the need for long-term solutions, but I mean, at least at this stage, what's your organization doing?
So thanks, Florence, for that introduction, and I also want to thank the fellow panelists. I'm delighted to hear that you're talking about things that we talk about every day in the bureau that I lead, Population, Refugees, and Migration. I also want to thank Commissioner Lenarčič and Minister Forssell for inviting me to be a panelist here with you today. As you mentioned, the Western Hemisphere is facing the biggest forced displacement and migration event in modern history. 20 million people, 20% of globally displaced population. I have the opportunity in my position to meet with a lot of these people, to meet with people like that very moving testimony that we heard in the beginning. And in fact, just 2 weeks ago, I was in Necoclí, Colombia, which is one of the highest traffic gateways from Colombia into the Darien Gap in Panama. And it was the most difficult trip that I have had to make in this position because I met so many people like the woman who gave that very emotional testimony. I met Venezuelans, Haitians, Nigerians, Bangladeshis, Colombians, waiting to head north, despite the known dangers on the way and no guarantee that they would be able to enter the United States. They were in the hands of people who were there to exploit them. In my brief interactions with them, I explained to them that the chances of them making it to the United States were very slim, that despite what the traffickers are telling them, the border is not open. We know that once they arrive in Necoclí, we can't forcibly stop them from trying to make the journey, but working with partner organizations, including two that are here in the panel with us today, we facilitate life-saving support for them, such as medical care or limited non-food assistance, baby food, formula. There are a lot of children on this route. But as we provide that assistance, it gives us the opportunity to have conversations with them and to engage with them to try to convince them to take an off-ramp. We explain to them about Colombia's generous decision to provide temporary protected status for Venezuelans for up to 10 years. We offer to help them integrate into new, safer lives in Colombia. And at the same time, we support Colombia and 16 other partners in the region and partner organizations' work in supporting the integration and livelihoods development for refugees and migrants. And I saw the results of that work during this trip as well. In both Necoclí and Medellín, I met with Venezuelan migrants who were building new lives in Colombia. And that was thanks to US-funded integration and support programs. But like most displaced people around the world, and Hugo, you can speak to this as well, we know that what they want most of all is to be able to go home safely, sustainably, voluntarily. But until they can do that, we need to work to help them thrive where they are. So creating the conditions for safe and voluntary returns in many Western Hemisphere countries is going to require deep systemic change. The Biden administration has prioritized developing and implementing approaches that address the root causes of migration, such as violence, climate change, and a lack of economic opportunity. We're also responding to new needs and developing long-term solutions. That includes working with the international community to promote political solutions to the crises of democracy in Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba, and Haiti, and to stem democratic backsliding elsewhere in the hemisphere. This supports what one Central American foreign minister refers to as the right to remain. We need to give people the right not to migrate, not to uproot their families, not to leave their communities. It is longer-term work, but it's critical. In the short and medium term, though, we need more humanitarian aid, more support for integration and livelihoods programs like the ones that I mentioned, and more efforts to open up further legal migration pathways and regularization options within the region and beyond. We know resources are limited, but we're asking all partners to dig deep and support refugees and migrants and host communities in the region. The United States is doing its part. Just last week, I led the US delegation to the International Conference in Solidarity with Venezuelan Refugees and Migrants, and the United States was proud to announce more than $171 million in new humanitarian and development assistance for the regional response. And that brings the total US response to the Venezuela crisis since 2017 to over $2.8 billion. Now, I want to thank the other participants in this conference for their collaboration as well. As Hugo mentioned, last June, President Biden stood alongside 20 other hemispheric leaders to endorse the Los Angeles Declaration on Migration and Protection. It's a roadmap and a framework for a hemispheric approach to migration. Since then, the endorsing countries have been putting a lot of work into actions to uphold the principles of the declaration. We have a long way to go, but the results are already promising. Because, in fact, there's no other way forward. The migration challenge is, as Ambassador Francis was saying, it is too big for any one country or one organization to tackle on its own, and that's why gatherings like this one are so important. So I want to thank you again for inviting me to participate.
Thank you very much. Mr. Terreño, over the last few years, the European Parliament has conducted several missions to the Latin American and Caribbean region, trying to assess the situation of these people on the move. And what were the main conclusions of those visits in terms of providing sustained funding from the EU? That would be the first part of my question. But the second part is really, it's not really only in terms of an immediate response, but we need to look at a more socio-economic integration, and that's a continuation of what we have just heard, you know, the longer-term solutions, sustainable solutions for those migrants and refugees.
Good morning, thank you. I have recently been appointed standing rapporteur for humanitarian aid at the Committee on Development in the European Parliament. I think I need to present myself also in this condition. My personal background is information management. During my life in academia, politics, and now in the European Parliament, I've worked mainly on development, energy, digital issues. I am the co-chair of the ACP, European Union Joint Parliamentary Assembly, and this is my first intervention in this capacity. So I would like to thank DG ECHO and the Swedish presidency for the invitation to participate in this forum. And before answering directly our question, I want to share very briefly some headlines of my thinking about this issue. In my view, funding, delivery, and resilience are fundamental pillars of any global, regional, or local intervention. Funding without delivery and resilience, is partially lost in entropy, and resilience without delivery, funding, and co-creation by major solutions in the field is, in my opinion, a miss. So, people needs to be our metrics. Unfortunately, our metrics on people needing emergency help is very alarming. About your question, the Parliament made recently 3 more important missions. One, the ad hoc delegation to the US-Mexico border, and the main purpose of this visit is to observe the situation with regard to the conditions of reception at the US-Mexico border for a human rights perspective, and this included viewing the access of asylum procedure, access to international protection, living conditions, reception centers, and the academics that talk with us, and also our conclusions, we conclude that several combined factors are pushing migrants to leave Central American countries. According, attention should also be paid to factors such as poverty and violence, as well as demography and climate change. And in addition to demographic and economic conditions, climate change provides strong incentives for migration. Experts drew the delegation attention to the correlation between severe drought affecting millions of people living in the North Triangle countries and the beginning of the current flow to the United States from 2015. Another mission of the delegation to Central America, to Honduras and Guatemala, stressed the question of the organized crime, violence, extortion, human rights violations against the indigenous population in the context of economic projects, and the effects of climate change and hurricanes are also improve a lot the flows. And more one example, in the end of the last year, the DROA mission to Colombia. It's very interesting. We conclude that the European Union need to fund more Colombia, and conclude also that Colombia is largely underfunded due to a very good reason, due to the fact that the Colombian government has been a model in welcoming those migrants by providing humanitarian assistance, registration, and temporary protection status, as well as adopting integration policies. So it's a good example that creates a big problem. This example shows that numerous countries in Latin America and Caribbean are facing multiple and overlapping political, economic, environmental, and security crises that are causing by the forced displacement of millions of people. The drivers of displacement are very different in Venezuela, or in Haiti, or in El Salvador, but I would underline that resilient, accountable, and representative state institutions are essential to prevent and respond to crises. And it is not possible to ignore the rapidly growing global humanitarian funding gap. In fact, advocating for additional public funding from donors inside and outside the European Union and from private funding to close this gap is a top priority, not just for me, but for the European Parliament as a whole. But it's also important to note that unequal funding received by crises around the world. I think that I need to finish. I want to say that the Development Committee is now working in an initiative report. Its title is How to Build an Innovative Humanitarian Health Strategy, Spotlight and Current and Forgotten Crises. We wish to vote this initiative report with proposals, numbers, and strategies in October, plenary in Strasbourg, and we wish to include the most possible contributions from the civil society. So please, we count on you to send us your ideas and also your experiences. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So political initiatives supporting the coordinated action that's already taken place. And to continue on the coordinated action, Ms. Lustgarten, you represent today LACMRD, which is a coalition of 30 of the main NGOs and CSOs responding to the human mobility crisis in the region. And I do mean crisis because we cannot just focus on one. And at the end of January, the coalition organized, and I quote, a dialogue towards coordinated regional perspective to strengthen the humanitarian response to the current dynamics of human mobility and emergency situation in the Central American region and Mexico. So clearly that must have been a very interesting event, and I'm sure that key recommendations came out of this dialogue. So could you share those recommendations with us and give us the key messages that you'd like to convey today, particularly coming out of that event?
Bueno, muchísimas gracias por la invitación y aquí muy encantada de estar con los panelistas. En nombre de la coalición de las organizaciones de la sociedad civil por los derechos de las personas refugiadas, migrantes y desplazadas en América Latina, coalición LAC-RMD, algunos miembros están aquí también dentro del público, quisiera agradecer a la Comisión Europea y especialmente a ECO por realmente organizar esta sesión tomando en cuenta América Latina. Durante el diálogo celebrado en febrero, se destacó el creciente aumento de las necesidades humanitarias en la región, abordando causas subyacentes como las causas del desplazamiento como la pobreza, la violencia, la desigualdad y los efectos del cambio climático. Hemos visto cifras, en el 2022 el desplazamiento en la región alcanzó niveles históricos debido al aumento de los movimientos mixtos que afectaron a todos los países de la región. Y el nivel de complejidad y el nivel de volumen creció de manera impresionante. América Latina y el Caribe tienen la tasa más alta de personas desplazadas a la fuerza y apatridias en todo el mundo, representando el 16% de la cifra global. Y sabemos que 37.6 millones de personas en Haití, el norte de Centroamérica, Colombia y Venezuela requieren asistencia humanitaria. En algunos de los países de América Latina y el Caribe se han incrementado los riesgos de protección, las violaciones de derechos humanos en las fronteras, la proliferación del crimen organizado, además de la trata y tráfico de personas, y testimonios como el de la señora que vimos, el incremento de la violencia basada en género realmente es impresionante, además de las desapariciones y las muertes en las rutas. Estos factores también han creado una situación muy compleja y desafiante para que las ONGs operen. Y se necesita una acción urgente para paliar estos efectos negativos y defender los derechos humanos en las fronteras. La situación continúa siendo crítica para estas personas, con falta de protección y acceso a servicios básicos como agua, saneamiento, alojamiento de emergencias e información esencial. Y quiero recalcar eso, muchas veces las personas no tienen información. A pesar de todos los esfuerzos que hacemos todos en conjunto, yo agradezco a los donantes y a los socios porque hemos realmente hecho muchos esfuerzos, pero a pesar de eso no se logra cumplir con todas las necesidades que tiene la población. Además, las ONGs afrontamos desafíos crecientes para implementar nuestros programas y proporcionar asistencia en ciertos lugares de la región. Estos desafíos incluyen limitaciones de acceso a la población y nuevas leyes restrictivas. Sufrimos, y como todos sabemos, un gran déficit de financiamiento y para poder realmente responder a la capacidad, con la capacidad que tenemos a las necesidades de estas personas. Realmente aplaudimos los esfuerzos de la semana pasada en la Conferencia de Solidaridad por los Refugiados y Migrantes de Venezuela y también en la mesa de alto nivel sobre el norte de Centroamérica por los fondos adicionales que están llegando, y agradecemos profundamente. Y tenemos que seguir trabajando porque definitivamente hay un subfinanciamiento. Aunque este panorama se ve difícil, pero también hemos visto en la región, y las ONG reconocemos, importantes esfuerzos de algunos gobiernos para la regularización, como lo dijo Julieta, la regularización e integración de los gobiernos que han puesto su esfuerzo para apoyar a esta población. Estos esfuerzos merecen ser un ejemplo a nivel global y recomendamos compartir estas buenas prácticas con los otros gobiernos porque esta es una respuesta regional. Y me permite, para finalizar, voy a leer las siguientes recomendaciones de las organizaciones de la sociedad civil que son producto de un diálogo sostenido que hemos tenido. Empiezo. Debemos apoyar la adopción de leyes y políticas consistentes y coordinadas a nivel regional que garanticen la protección y seguridad de las personas en tránsito. Aumentar la financiación y los recursos para los esfuerzos de respuesta humanitaria en la región, incluyendo el apoyo a las ONG locales y organizaciones lideradas por personas refugiadas, migrantes y desplazadas, para lo cual los esfuerzos en localización deben dotarse de mecanismos reales. Ampliar los mecanismos de financiación multianual y multipaís. Y quiero adicionar algo, y es el financiamiento flexible. Ayer estuve en un panel muy interesante sobre financiamiento flexible con el fin de garantizar que los esfuerzos de integración sean efectivos a mediano plazo. Es clave la participación del sector privado en estos esfuerzos. Esta crisis necesita tanto financiación humanitaria como de desarrollo, como se habló ahora en el panel, fomentando el enfoque de nexo para garantizar respuestas efectivas. Se necesitan esfuerzos renovados de coordinación por parte de las agencias de Naciones Unidas para abordar eficazmente los desafíos que enfrenta la región. Es urgente evitar la duplicación de mecanismos de coordinación a nivel regional y asegurar que los existentes estén alineados y bien financiados, sobre todo para apoyar el rol de la sociedad civil. Hacemos un llamado para incluir a la sociedad civil en los mecanismos de implementación de la Declaración de Los Ángeles y la Cumbre Unión Europea Comunidad de Estados Latinoamericanos y Caribeños, entre otros, para que todas las voces sean escuchadas y sus aportes y recomendaciones sean tenidos en cuenta. Mejorar el acceso humanitario para las organizaciones que operan en la región. Eso es un esfuerzo compartido entre gobiernos, agencias de Naciones Unidas y sociedad civil, fomentando el respeto de los principios humanitarios y asegurando el respeto de los derechos humanos en la gestión de fronteras. apoyar a los gobiernos tanto nacionales como locales en el fortalecimiento y políticas y programas que contribuyan a la integración de las personas refugiadas y migrantes, fomentar y mejorar los mecanismos de identificación de personas con necesidad de protección internacional dentro de la dinámica de los flujos mixtos, así como fortalecer los sistemas de asilo de toda la región, para lo cual el rol del ACNUR y sus socios es fundamental. Y finalmente, debemos recordar que las respuestas a estas crisis siempre están en el terreno, donde está la gente, donde está la sociedad civil. Es, por tanto, vital para asegurar una respuesta efectiva que sus ideas y sus recomendaciones sean escuchadas y tenidas en cuenta. Las ONGs estamos listos para ayudar con todos los esfuerzos. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. I would like to remind all of you that you can prepare your questions, including if you are online via Slido, do send them to us. And before we move to a bit more of a discussion, debate part, I think we should check where we stand with our graphic recording. So let's have a look what our graphic artist has made of your various contributions so far. Where do we stand? Yeah, I'm afraid for those of you sitting on the panel, you probably have to turn around because it's a bit far over there. So a few highlights: the right to remain, long-term solutions, human mobility, which unfortunately sometimes is in trucks and not necessarily in the best conditions there either. And little human figures on the move. So let's see where we are when we come towards the end of our discussion. First of all, before I turn to the floor, I'd like to ask you if one of you would like to react to what somebody else said, whether it's in terms of long-term solution, coordination, the LA Declaration, if you would like to come back on any of the points that have been mentioned. Yes, please, Mrs. Serino.
Thank you very much. I want to come back to this idea of the long-term solutions and the flexible financing. I think they are very, very important. We need really to have a development perspective to avoid displacement. And I want to underline the two programs of the European Union, for instance, the Global Europe and the Global Gateway. It's not only to this goal, but it's also for this goal, to have a development process based in the SDGs and the Agenda 2030. But I think it is very important, this idea, to have a flexible financement, to reform the multilateral banks, and also to promote co-creation. When I speak about resilience, of people that stay in the difficult grounds, resilience of people that need to displace, and resilience of communities that need to receive the displaced people, we need to think about to redesign solutions, including all that are in the process. It's very, very, very important to put money in this process and to give visibility to this process. So I want to say that, yes, we talk a lot about you have a lack of funding, but you have a lot of funding also. You need to use it in the best way possible and to be flexible, to reform the multilateral financing model and to promote co-creation. It's, in my perspective, a good way to achieve success.
Thank you. Would anybody? Yes, please.
So I just want to note how pleased I was to hear everyone talk about the importance of collaboration to address these issues, collaboration between countries of origin, countries of transit, countries of destination. We're now seeing in the hemisphere that there are some countries that are in more than one category at the same time. Colombia, for example, is a country of origin, a country of transit, and a country of destination. But also the importance of working together with our international organization partners, our non-governmental organization partners, civil society, but I want to pick up on a point that you made, which is the importance of also including the affected people themselves in that discussion. We have to have accountability to the affected populations. We need to talk to the migrants, to the refugees, to hear their ideas and their solutions, and we really all need to work together to address what is really a historic challenge, but also a historic opportunity. Thanks.
Thank you. Yes, please, Ms. Daniels.
Just picking up where Julieta ended, all I would add to that is that when we are having these discussions, it's really important to also have the bank and the development actors as part of the discussion, because we're not going to get to solutions if we're not all in the same room coming together to see how do our different contributions connect for for a sustainable solution. Because even in humanitarian life-saving action, we need to be providing that in a way that enables, facilitates, catalyzes a long-term solution. And for us to be able to do that, we need all of the actors Julieta mentioned, but we also need the banks, the development actors, to be part of this discussion.
Your Excellency, you wanted to add something to that?
Yes, thank you. Just to add to the dimension of what Julieta was mentioning from the governmental side as well, I want to make reference to the ministerial meeting that Panama summoned in April 2022. That was a brilliant example of how we need to really integrate countries of origin, of transit, and destiny, that as the crisis gets bigger, that line starts to dissipate in many cases, as happens, as you mentioned, with Colombia, also in Panama, in terms of having many of these regularizations happening at a very small country of population. But the idea is, at that time, there was a gathering of ministers of foreign affairs, ministers of government, and also the heads of migration of all of the countries from north to south. And that discussion gave place to a very candid positioning of what's really the problem and how to tackle it, which was continued, as you all mentioned, in the summit of Los Angeles later on. So it's fundamental that the governments and all the policy makers have the same road, even though there are different elements, because we all have different elements in our countries, and that's natural and that's perfectly viable, but that we have the same aim, the same task, fundamental task, which at the end of the day is to protect the lives and the future of all these migrants. And it's a three-pillar thing, as we have mentioned it. The first one is the immediate and rapid response to save their lives when they decide to take the path. The second one is their future and shaping it from the physical and the mental positioning. And the third one, and in parallel, is to tackle the origin and the causes to cause that migration, which is a fundamental part as well from the communities, from the governments and the international organizations.
Thank you very much. Would you like to add something, maybe, Ms. Lisgarten?
Yo quisiera adicionar un punto muy importante, me parece que fue Julieta lo que mencionó, es tenemos que pensar en estas personas realmente que traen algo muy positivo a los países donde están. Muchas veces nos olvidamos y a la población la segmentamos. Entonces están los refugiados e inmigrantes y los otros, ¿verdad? Pero, ¿qué está pasando con esta población cuando llega a algún lugar? Está realmente creando algo distinto y positivo al lugar donde llegan. Y tenemos que rescatar esa parte también. Pero también trabajar en los root causes, que yo creo que esto también es un tema muy importante, ¿correcto? Pero tenemos que ver la parte positiva de lo que trae esta población a los países donde llega. Gracias.
Thank you very much. So the floor is open, ladies and gentlemen. We have questions. Yes, the first question I saw is from a gentleman at the back there to your left. I don't know where the person with the mic is. Okay, yes, there's a gentleman there with a raised hand and I think a light blue shirt from what I can see here. Yes, right in front of you, to your right. Yes, that was the first hand I saw.
Gracias. I will make my presentation in Spanish, following some of the members of the board. Mi nombre es José Luis Barreiro, yo soy el coordinador del Foro de ONGs Humanitarias de Colombia, que engloba a 30 organizaciones. Gracias por invitarnos a esta reunión, tanto a la Unión Europea, a Suecia y también a ICVA, gracias a la cual estamos 30 miembros de foros del sur en este espacio. Es importante. Unas cifras y tres problemas y tres recomendaciones. Cifras. El foro de Colombia ha estimado que en Colombia, en el año 2022, entre el 1 de enero y el 31 de diciembre, 390.000 personas sufrieron desplazamiento dentro del país el año pasado. 390.000 personas recientes y con necesidades humanitarias. El foro ha estimado que el 2% de la población venezolana en Colombia no solamente son migrantes con necesidades más o menos intensas de acuerdo al tiempo en que están, sino que han sido entre el 1 de enero de 2022 y el 31 de diciembre de 2022 el 2% desplazados por violencia, por amenazas de grupos armados o por enfrentamientos. Esto supone aproximadamente unas 60.000 personas. Estas son las cifras que ustedes decían que se necesitan y que necesitamos tener no solo para Colombia, como la que tenemos nosotros, además de analizarla, pero regionalmente no sabemos cómo es la situación de desplazamiento dentro de Venezuela, no lo sabemos, del arco minero, y está mi colega del Foro de Venezuela que seguramente puede mencionar esto. No sabemos cuántos desplazados hay en Honduras por la violencia, no estamos hablando de migrantes. En El Salvador no sabemos cuántos desplazados hay en México. Es decir, tenemos unos vacíos para identificar los problemas de sufrimiento de protección que tiene la población en la región. Y esto es importante para destacarlo y que tenemos un vacío como actores humanitarios para identificar estas poblaciones. Bueno, esas son las cifras. Tres problemas, y ustedes lo han mencionado. En Colombia estamos sufriendo cada vez más barreras de acceso humanitario por parte de los grupos armados organizados, incluso por aquellos que están en los procesos de negociación de paz. Y esto, aunque parece contradictorio, ha habido una retirada del Estado de grandes zonas y los grupos armados están incrementando la presión sobre la población y están incrementando, lo que no veíamos hace muchos años, la limitación de acceso de los actores humanitarios. Regiones como Catatumbo, colombiana, cerca de la frontera, ha estado cerrada desde mediados de diciembre porque el ELN, los grupos armados que están presentes allá y que están negociando, han prohibido la entrada. Y esto hay que decirlo porque los principios humanitarios y una acción basada en principios tiene que ser respetada. Incluso...
Sir, I'm sorry, but can I ask you to
Okay,
really try and
yes.
shorten? We have a lot of questions,
Okay,
so I'd like
vale.
to take as many as possible.
De acuerdo, de acuerdo. Pedimos que se sigan haciendo esfuerzos de diplomacia humanitaria como la hace ECO, como la hace el CICR o Geneva Call. Pedimos que la doble arquitectura humanitaria que tenemos en Colombia se encuentre en medios para solucionarla. Estamos trabajando con doble arquitectura, dobles figuras y doble trabajo para todos los actores humanitarios. Y pedimos que, respecto a la financiación, se implementen en la región los fondos canasta, que son útiles no solamente para la flexibilidad y para llegar rápida, sino además para poder proveer fondos a los actores locales. Gracias.
Thank you. If you all agree, I suggest we take a couple of interventions and we group them so that you can react afterwards. So I have the lady there, right on the edge, right in front. Yes, I have a gentleman here and two more there. Okay.
Hello, good morning.
And I'm sorry, but can you keep it short, please?
Coming from a Venezuelan family, I would like to ask you something considering the myriad of barriers and bureaucratization that it's posed. How can the EU member states, the international community of organizations ensure that refugees and migrants seeking asylum here in Europe have proper access to basic rights, including good working conditions, considering the fact that we live in an era of rising xenophobia and discrimination? So how can we tackle this challenge within the EU? The other question I would like to ask, how can we ensure that better and more effective public integration policies are in place here in the EU for people coming from Latin America and from the Caribbean region, while we all know that some of the benefits that most of European communities do have are not applicable to those migrants and asylum seekers seeking a refuge here in Europe? Thank you.
Thank you. So I have a gentleman here on the front.
Muchas gracias. Mi nombre es Pedro Hernández, represento a la presidencia pro tempore del proceso de Quito. Saludo especialmente su intervención. Solo 2 o 3 comentarios. Primero, agradecer la mención al principio del derecho a no migrar. Creemos que ese principio que usted ha presentado es un desafío para nuestros países. Para quienes somos o han sido países de origen, hoy día somos países de acogida o de tránsito. Así que en esta iniciativa Chile, como usted lo sabe, lidera el paquete de acción número 1 de la Declaración de Los Ángeles y renovamos ciertamente que allí hay una clave. La segunda dimensión que quiero señalar, que el proceso de Quito justamente busca lo que usted ha propuesto, coordinarse con los otros procesos regionales. Coincidimos con usted en que no es necesario crear otros foros, pero sí, y vuelvo a la Declaración de Los Ángeles, la presidencia pro tempore quiso hacer una síntesis entre lo que es la historia del proceso de Quito con los lineamientos principales de la Declaración de Los Ángeles y propuso 4 paquetes de trabajo. 1, el desarrollo sostenible de las comunidades locales. Y ahí voy a hacer una pregunta al panel. 2, la promoción de la residencia y la regularización migratoria. Sabemos que una persona regularizada está visibilizada para todos los sistemas y permite un mejor acceso a sus derechos. Tercero, por ende, el acceso a derechos. No solamente los derechos fundamentales, sino que también el derecho, por ejemplo, a una vivienda digna. 4, la cooperación internacional y la cooperación regional. Entonces, solo quería hacer una pregunta porque todos han coincidido, y usted en particular, en representación de la sociedad civil, en el rol de los migrantes y su aporte a las comunidades locales. Pero todos sabemos también que en nuestras comunidades locales hay ciertos niveles de xenofobia, que es el gran desafío que también tenemos que enfrentar. Entonces la pregunta al panel es, ¿cómo integramos en el proceso migratorio a las comunidades locales, a quienes reciben? Y ese proceso que usted invita a reflexionar es muy interesante. No es solo el aporte, sino qué síntesis se genera a partir de ese diálogo, de ese encuentro, de esa comunión entre el que recibe y al que llega. Ahí hay un proceso de integración recíproca que tal vez tengamos que trabajar. Y felicito muy sinceramente a este panel y la oportunidad que nos han dado de poder intervenir hoy día, como lo hemos hecho también los días pasados. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. So maybe we'll start here and take a second batch of questions afterwards, but the shorter the questions, the more we can take. So we'll try and fit in a few more. So who'd like to react? Maybe, I mean, we need to better identify the needs. That was one point. Access to basic rights. And when it comes to the EU, more specifically, maybe I'll ask Mr. Zorinu. But need for more coordination. Okay, so I see several of you nodding. So maybe starting with you.
So I'll give a quick answer so that we can have time for more questions. Could not agree more about the need to support host communities as well as migrants and refugees. As we have seen many times, migrants and refugees wind up in communities with reduced resources themselves. And we need, as a donor community and as international organizations and our partners, we have to support everyone in these communities, because otherwise we can see situations of xenophobia and we can see situations that could create greater vulnerabilities for migrants if they are resented because migrants are receiving more assistance than the communities where they're living. So we have to provide support that reaches everyone. Also could not agree more about the importance of legal pathways as a alternative to irregular migration, and that's why we are increasing the number of worker visas. We had the largest number ever in 2022 in the United States. We're increasing refugee resettlement. We're increasing family reunification programs. We have a major new parole program for Venezuelans, Nicaraguans, Cubans, and Haitians, all to provide regular pathways so that people do not need to undertake this dangerous journey. Thanks.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Solamente reaccionando, y muchas gracias por sus palabras, sobre el tema de la comunidad, acuerdo con Julieta, porque realmente tenemos que trabajar, porque muchas veces son las mismas condiciones en las que vive la población local y la que y con la gente que está llegando. Pero tomar en cuenta que la gente que está llegando no tiene redes de protección como lo puede tener la población local. Sin embargo, la asistencia humanitaria que se da tiene que ser lo que se llama en los términos humanitarios que los conocemos todos, sí, acción sin daño. Nosotros no podemos entrar a una comunidad y realmente crear ese tipo de diferencias, ¿correcto? Creo que esto es un tema muy importante y creo que los donantes y los socios que apoyan nuestros proyectos están más conscientes cada vez que los fondos no son solamente para la población refugiada. Y la segunda cosa, y acabo rápidamente, el trabajo con los gobiernos locales es fundamental para poder entender también qué quieren los gobiernos locales con su población. Y esto es esencial. Gracias.
Thank you. Mr. Zerigno, maybe more on the European aspect and how can we ensure that rights are granted.
As you know, integration of migrants and refugees in the European Union is a main issue. It's not only a main issue in a humanitarian point of view, and you all know all days what happens in the Mediterranean Sea, but not only in all the European Union. Also the difference between different approaches to different people coming from different places. But where I'm telling that, I'm also explaining the consciousness that this issue is a main political issue in the European Union. Is now, as all of we know, is the political changer. Now, many of the elections in the European Union are decided by this issue. So we need to address it as a priority in a humanitarian perspective. And one of the things we need to do is to have legal green lines to receive the migrants and the refugees. We have a more efficient system to give visas and so on. But we need also an economic and social approach. You need to create projects that show to the host communities that the coming of new people for a whole Europe could be a win-win game.
Thank you. Yes, please, Ms. Daniels.
Yes, there were some comments with regard to migratory regularization and on the issue of xenophobia. And in the, I want to say cartoon, but you had a nicer name for it. Up there was the global refugee crisis. And I really want to use this opportunity to emphasize that when it comes to migration, and certainly from the perspective of IOM, we do not frame migration as a crisis. Let's keep in mind that remittances last year were 700 billion. That's 3 times global total ODA and are a force, a significant force and contribution to sustainable development. And my fellow panelists had spoken about the positive contribution of migration to not just socioeconomic development, but society overall. Where there, and for migration, certainly as IOM, we work very closely with governments on establishing legal pathways, on supporting successful reintegration, on understanding from the migrants themselves what is required for a sustainable solution or for a sustainable reintegration. Where a crisis, if we're going to speak of a crisis at all, it comes to irregular migration, and this is where xenophobia comes in, because it's the irregular migrants that hit the headlines, not the great contributions that migrants are making. And that's why opportunities for legal pathways, but also addressing, and many panelists have spoken about this, addressing the root causes and the drivers of irregular migration at home. But I do want to make sure that we leave with a balanced narrative, because it's the imbalance and the polarization which is then fueling the xenophobia. And please, let's always highlight the significant contribution migrants are making around the world. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm now going to take a question we have received online, and it's in French, so if you'd like to use your headsets, it basically says, how can we reduce the, well, yeah, I mean, I'm going to let the interpreters do it. They'll do it much better than me, but it's just I wanted to give you time to use your headsets if you want. So I'm going to read it aloud in French just to inform the interpreters. Comment faire en sorte de diminuer la chaîne d'intermédiaires pour qu'il y ait plus d'impact sur les communautés malgré les ressources insuffisantes? So, who would like to pick up on that? How to reduce the number of intermediaries so that the impact on communities is more forceful despite lacking resources, missing resources? It's, yeah, you seem puzzled, so.
If I understood, and it's not an issue of translation, but if I understood the question properly, the reason why there's such a long chain of intermediaries is what happens when you opt for irregular ways in which to move. The more legal pathways that there are, the more regular pathways that there are for people to move, the less the likelihood of having traffickers, smugglers, all of those along the route. And it's actually a chain of, I mean, intermediaries is a nice way to put it, but really, there are people who are exploiting and trafficking migrants and refugees all along the route. So if people don't have options that enable them to stay at home, or options that enable them to move regularly, they will opt for these irregular options.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid I have to stop here for questions simply because we have a strict time constraint. But I would like to invite Andrea Kolaima, who's Deputy Director General of DG ECHO at the Commission, to deliver her key takeaways. And I mean, there are quite a few already. So, Andrea, please.
Thanks a lot, Florence, and thanks to the panel for some great ideas. I'd like also to thank the graphic designer because I think he had a very good intermediate summary which helped me also structure a bit my ideas around this. Let me start with the diagnostic. The diagnostic you all made was, I would say, a mixed diagnostic. I came here thinking we would have a pessimistic one, you know, the figures, the number of people who are on the move, the difficult conditions in the transfer through Darien and through other ways, the terrible testimony we heard at the beginning of the session. But we also heard some positive aspects of the diagnostic, everything linked to the legal pathways. This incredible figure in terms of remittances, which brings the question, is there any way we can harness some of these remittances to help in the humanitarian response? And I leave that part aside for you to consider. So a mixed image, a number of recommendations. One, I think, a takeaway I keep very strongly is that we need to have a human-centered approach. We need to know better who the people who are moving and what the characteristics of these people are, what their needs are, the reasons why they move, but also what their potential is to make a contribution once they move out of the crisis situation in which they find themselves. That element of information, data management, is definitely an extremely important one. On the dark side, there is also the element of the benefit that these migrations, notably illegal migration, is giving to traffickers and others who are taking advantage of this process. We did not talk so much about law enforcement, but I guess that's something also which has to be put into the picture. I would welcome in that context the comment made by our colleague José Luis from Colombia in terms of looking at the multiplicity of crises in the same environment, be it the internal displacement, internal conflict, but also then the migration path which comes on top of it. I think we had a good talk about the coordination of the response, and there were several levels which were addressed. First, the intergovernmental cooperation, and I tried to get the figures, and I think we don't yet get a full match. I think when talking about the LA declaration, we talked about 21 countries. If we talk about the R4V platform, we're talking about 17 countries. If I look at roughly the geography of Latin America and the Caribbean, I think we have more than either 21 or 17. And if we hear what Yavel told us about the number of nationalities which are crossing the Darien, we are above the 40s. So I think there we have probably some progress to make in terms of making sure that all the countries who have a stake in this are actually part of the conversation. The second aspect of coordination, which is very important, is something that came up more from the questions in the field and briefly touched upon by our HIAS colleague, is the question of the duplication of coordination mechanisms and setups. And I think that is somewhere where, as humanitarian actors, as humanitarian community, is something which can be actionable as a way in terms of progress, at least to make sure that the funding that we provide is made the best use of. On Colombia specifically, nobody mentioned the flagship initiative of OCHA, but I think it's worth to keeping it in mind. There are 4 countries where OCHA has initiated this flagship initiative. One of them is Colombia. That could be an entry point also to try to see how the system can best be reformed. Last element, because I know we're running out of time, is come back to some words that came a lot in this conversation: collaboration, co-creation, engagement of all the stakeholders, first and foremost also those who represent the migrant communities themselves. If I compared it to the discussion we had in some other panels where we realized that the situation was very complex and probably difficult to handle, I come out more hopeful of this one. The situation is indeed complex, but there is an alignment in the diagnosis of the situation. There is a willingness from the countries of the region to tackle the situation, and there is a willingness from civil society, the UN, as well as countries and governments in the region to work together. So it is a big challenge, but I think it's a challenge that can be worked on to get a better situation for the migrants, refugees, as well as their host communities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrea, for picking up on several of the key points that have been discussed. And thanks to our graphic artist, because it is work in progress, so you could see the drawings actually coming up. So a very good summary of our discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes this debate. I'd like a big round of applause for our speakers this morning. Thank you all very much for being with us. Thank you.
And can we thank the interpreters as well? Thank you so much.
Absolutely. That was my next step.